Welcome to a tour of Washington in the 1700s, one of the greatest cities during a century of elegance, enlightenment, and ultimately revolution. Using advanced AI technology, we'll be transforming centuries-old engravings and paintings into photorealistic scenes, giving you a true sense of what life was in 1700s. Washington City did not begin as a dream. It began as a problem. In the final years of the 1700s, the United States had won its independence, but it had not yet secured its future. The nation was fragile, its unity uncertain, its power theoretical. The question was simple. That dangerous, where would power live? Not symbolically. Physically, because in the 18th century, power was not an idea. It was a place. Philadelphia had hosted Congress. New York had housed the first government. Both believed they deserved permanence, but permanence was exactly what the founders feared. They had just escaped one distant capital, ruling them without consent. They would not replace London with another city that could dominate the rest. So they did something unusual. They chose emptiness, a stretch of land along the Potomac River, humid, undeveloped, politically neutral and strategically positioned between north and south, a place with no past and, if managed carefully, no rivals. This was not idealism, it was calculation. George Washington understood this better than anyone. He had seen how geography shaped power during the war, how rivers moved armies, how distance protected authority, how capitals could be threatened, burned, or captured. In 1783, while Congress met in Philadelphia, unpaid soldiers surrounded the building, demanding wages. The government fled. That humiliation lingered. Never again, Washington believed, should the national government depend on any single state for protection. A federal capital had to belong to the nation alone. The Residence Act of 1790 made it law. 10 square miles, independent of all states governed by Congress, designed from scratch. But passing the law was only the beginning. What rose from the swamps would determine whether the American experiment survived. Washington City in the 1790s was not impressive. It was raw mud roads, scattered farms, forests still standing where monuments would one day rise. Foreign diplomats laughed when they arrived. Some called it a wilderness masquerading as a capital. Others assumed the project would fail. They had seen grand plans collapse before, but they misunderstood the purpose. This city was not meant to impress the world, yet it was meant to control the future. Pierre Charles London, a French engineer and veteran of the American Revolution, was tasked with designing the city. His vision was bold. Wide avenues cutting through grids, grand sight lines connecting power to space. Buildings placed not for convenience but symbolism. The Capitol on a hill, the president's house set apart, no palace dominating the skyline. Power would be visible, but separated. Balanced lawn fawn clashed with officials, ignored property lines and refused compromise. Eventually, he was dismissed, but his core vision survived because Washington the man protected it. He personally oversaw the city's development, chose the location of major buildings, pushed construction forward despite resistance, delays, and ridicule. This was not vanity. Washington had no desire to rule from marble halls, but he understood something critical. A weak capital would create a weak nation, and a nation born weak would not survive long among empires. By 1797, when Washington left the presidency, the city was still unfinished. The Capitol was incomplete, the White House barely livable. Streets existed more on paper than on ground. Yet the foundations were set not just in stone, in intent. The city would not belong to merchants, or generals, or mobs. It would belong to institutions, and institutions, if designed correctly, could outlive men. When John Adams arrived as president in 1800, he moved into a half-built White House surrounded by fields. He wrote to his wife that he prayed only wise and honest men would rule beneath its roof. It was a quiet admission. The city itself offered no protection. Power here would survive only if the system worked. And if it failed, Washington City would become a symbol of American collapse. This uncertainty was not accidental. It was deliberate. The founders believed discomfort kept leaders humble, distance limited corruption. Isolation reduced temptation. Washington City was not built for pleasure. It was built for endurance. Even in its earliest years, its message was clear. This was not Rome, not London, not Paris. There was something new, a capital designed to restrain itself. But restraint, history would soon reveal, does not mean weakness. Sometimes it is the most dangerous form of strength. And the world was about to find out. Washington City did not wait to be finished before it began ruling. That was its first test. When the federal government officially moved to the Potomac in 1800, there was no real city to arrive in. There were buildings, yes, but they were isolated, surrounded by open land, mud, and uncertainty. Congress met in an unfinished capitol. The president lived in a house still smelling of wet plaster. Clerks worked in cramped rooms, carrying documents across fields instead of streets. And yet power functioned not smoothly, not comfortably, but deliberately. This was the point. The founders did not want government to feel easy. They wanted it to feel heavy. Washington City forced leaders to confront the effort. Required to govern a republic, nothing came effortlessly here. In winter, roads became rivers of mud. In summer, heat and mosquitoes filled the air. Foreign ambassadors complained constantly. Some refused to stay long. Others mocked the capital openly, calling it an embarrassment, a provincial experiment, unfit for serious diplomacy. But beneath the surface discomfort, something important was happening. The separation of power was being tested in real space. The capital was not next to the president's house by accident. Distance required deliberation. Messages had to be carried. Decisions slowed just enough to prevent impulse. Washington City did not encourage spectacle. It encouraged process. Congress, divided into House and Senate, learned to operate without social convenience. Members lodged in boarding houses scattered across the area, mixing with rivals and allies alike. Politics followed them into shared dining rooms, into Camelot. Conversations late at night into arguments that did not end when sessions closed. This informal closeness balanced the formal separation of institutions. The city itself became a silent referee. Alexander Hamilton had envisioned a strong financial center. He found none here, Thomas Jefferson imagined. The Republic of Reason and Restraint. He found conditions that demanded both. Washington City stripped leaders of luxury and forced them into proximity with consequence. Nothing here distracted from power, which made mistakes harder to hide. The early capital also sent a message outward. This government was not tied to commerce. It was not dependent on ports, banks, or wealthy elites. It sat inland, deliberately protected by geography, yet removed from immediate pressure. Foreign governments noticed they understood capitals as centers of wealth and culture. Washington City was not built to dominate the economy. It was built to dominate decision-making, and decision-making in the 1700s was power. Still, the city's weakness remained visible. Few permanent residents, limited infrastructure, minimal defenses. Critics wondered how long it could survive. That question would soon be answered. But before war, same fire, another test arrived. First, politics. The election of 1800, one of the most dangerous transitions in American history. John Adams lost. Thomas Jefferson won. For the first time, power changed hands peacefully between opposing political visions. And it happened here. Not in a grand capital filled with tradition, but in one half-built city with no precedent to protect it. There were fears of violence, of refusal, of collapse. None came. The city held, institutions functioned. The transfer was quiet, almost anticlimactic. And that was its greatest. Access. Washington City proved something vital. Power did not require grandeur to survive. It required rules, restraint, and a place removed from passion. By the early years of Jefferson's presidency, the capital still looked unfinished, but it was no longer uncertain it had done its job. The system had survived its first internal challenge. The question now was external. Could this fragile city survive an enemy? Could a capital built on restraint withstand force? The answer would arrive in smoke and flame. By the time war reached Washington City, no one pretended it was ready. The year was 1814. The War of 1812 had dragged on longer than anyone expected. The young republic was exhausted, divided, and uncertain. Britain was no longer distracted by Europe. Napoleon had been defeated. The empire could finally focus its attention westward, and it chose the capital. Washington City was an obvious target. It had symbolic value, political value, and almost no military protection. The city had grown slightly since its founding, but it was still spread thin. Government buildings stood far apart. Defensive works were minimal. Militia forces were untrained and poorly coordinated. Even members of Congress doubted the British would bother. That doubt proved fatal. In August, British forces landed in Maryland and advanced toward the capital. American defenses collapsed almost immediately. At Bladensburg, the road to Washington lay open. What followed was not a battle. There was a collapse. Government officials fled. Records were hastily packed or abandoned. The president himself escaped the city. James Madison rode out under cover of confusion, leaving the capital exposed. The city that had been designed to restrain power now faced its greatest danger. An enemy had arrived. British troops marched into Washington City on the evening of August 24, 1814. They met little resistance. What they found was not a proud capital, but a quiet one. Buildings stood unfinished. Streets were dark. The population had vanished. Then the fires began. The capital was satellite. Flames tore through its chambers, consuming the heart of American legislation. The president's house burned next, its white stone walls blackened by smoke. Other government buildings followed. For a moment, the experiment seemed over, a capital captured and destroyed barely a generation after independence. In Europe, this would have ended regimes. Here it did not. Because Washington City was not the nation. It was only the seat of its institutions, and those institutions survived. British commanders did not occupy the city, they destroyed and left. They had no interest in holding ground. Their objective was humiliation, not conquest. The following day, a violent storm tore through the city. Rain extinguished the fires. A tornado, according to some accounts, cut through the area, killing soldiers on both sides. To contemporaries, it felt like providence. But survival was not divine. There was structural. The federal government resumed work almost immediately. Congress reconvened in temporary quarters. Plans to abandon the city were debated. Some argued the capital should be moved again, that Washington had proven itself indefensible. But the argument failed. Leaving would have meant surrendering authority. The fear rebuilding became an act of defiance. The capital was restored. The president's house was repaired, painted white to cover the scars of fire. The city emerged changed, not stronger in appearance, stronger in meaning. Washington City had been tested and had not broken. Foreign powers took notice. The message was clear. This government did not depend on walls. It did not collapse when buildings fell. Power resided in continuity, in law, in institutions that could function even after destruction. From that moment on, Washington City was no longer provisional. It was permanent. The capital had once been marked as a swamp, had survived imperial fire. And that survival altered how America saw itself. The city would grow, infrastructure would improve, defenses would strengthen. But its true power had already been proven. It could be burned, but it could not be erased. The final question remained. How did a city born in weakness become the command center of a global power? That answer lies not in architecture, but in control. After the fires of 1814, Washington City no longer had the luxury of uncertainty. It had survived destruction. Now it had to justify survival, rebuilding. Slow, deliberate, and symbolic, the capital is reconstructed not merely as it had been, but stronger. The president's house returned with cleaner lines, brighter stone, and a new identity. What had burned was replaced. What had failed was corrected. The lesson was not that Washington needed walls. It was that it needed permanence. Throughout the early 19th century, the city grew in quiet ways. Population increased steadily. Roads improved, institutions multiplied. But it never became a commercial giant. And that, again, was intentional. New York became the nation's financial heart. Philadelphia retained intellectual weight. Boston shaped culture. Washington remained something else entirely, a city of decision. By keeping commerce at a distance, the federal government preserved autonomy. Power here was not owned, it was exercised. The expansion of federal departments reshaped the city's influence. Treasury's war state bureaucracy, often dismissed as dull, became the city's greatest weapon. Paper replaced swords. Files replaced fortifications. Procedure replaced spectacle. This was power that did not shout. It endured Washington City's physical isolation, became strategic strength. It could not be surrounded by mobs easily. It could not be captured without intent. It did not react quickly to passion. That slowness protected it. As the nation expanded westward, the capital did not move. States multiplied. Borders shifted. Wars reshaped. Territory Washington remained fixed. This stability sent a message. Power did not fall. A population. Population followed power. Foreign governments adapted accordingly. Embassies replaced temporary missions. Permanent diplomats arrived. Negotiations moved from port cities to this quiet center of authority. By the mid-1800s, no one laughed anymore. Washington City had become unavoidable not because it was beautiful, not because it was wealthy, but because every decision passed through it. The city's design continued to reinforce control. Monuments rose slowly. Deliberately, space remained open. No single structure dominated. The capital resisted crowns, towers, and palaces. Even as America's power grew, its capital maintained restraint. That restraint was the secret. Washington City was never built to glorify leaders. It was built, survived them. Presidents came and went. Parties rose and collapsed. Crises shook the nation. The city absorbed it all, and that is what made it untouchable. Not invincibility, continuity. When power is dispersed, balanced, and institutionalized, it cannot be seized in one strike. You can burn buildings, you can remove individuals, you can even win battles. But you cannot overthrow a system that has been designed to persist. Washington City in the 1700s was dismissed as a gamble. By the 1800s, it had proven itself. By the modern era, it had become something far more. Dangerous, a capital that does not rely on force to rule, only on permanence. The capital that could not be taken. Washington City was never meant to inspire awe. It was meant to survive pressure born from compromise, fear, and strategic restraint. It rejected the traditions of imperial capitals. It chose distance over dominance, process over spectacle, institutions over individuals. It endured political division. It survived invasion and fire. It absorbed expansion without relocating power by separating wealth from authority, emotion from governance, and leadership from permanence. Washington became something rare, a capital that could be attacked, burned, and rebuilt without losing control. That is why it endured. That is why it became untouchable. And that is why power, even today, still flows through a city that was never supposed to be impressive at all. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching.